This morning we start with Keith Kron, Director of the Transitions Office, providing an overview of this fascinating period of our history. Now, I've known Keith from the time he was director of what was then known as the Office of Bisexual, Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Concerns. You know, as the office has changed, the title has changed, it reflects, I think, our growing understanding of gender orientation and gender identity. And I think for many of us, it has been a stretching time. And that's good, right? Right? Another blank stretch, no. Keith served as the head of that office from 1996 to 2010. That is an eternity, and you speak. He has visited over 450 Unitarian Universalist congregations, helping them work in welcoming congregations, beyond categorical thinking workshops, and on public witness. So it was natural that John and I turned to Keith as we struggled to lead our congregation in Baltimore and work in Maryland to establish justice, compassion, and respect for all people. It was to Keith we turned for advice when we decided, after some mulling, took us a while, that we were not going to sign any marriage licenses until everyone could get married. It was to Keith we turned to when we were going to retire from Baltimore, and we wanted to be sure that work would continue. And it's been to Keith in his current position as the director of the Transitions Office that John and I turned to when we decided to serve as interim ministers. It should be no surprise, then, that we've turned to Keith when we started to imagine these conferences. He has been committed to these conferences, returned my calls, my emails, promptly, more than promptly, brainstormed with me, batted a few balls around metaphorically. I am honored and delighted to introduce to you Keith Kron.
It is good to be here with you all today. And this morning, I'm going to do what we're doing in a couple of different phases. First, I'm going to talk about some people. And then we'll do an exercise, and then we'll take a break. And then I'm going to come back and talk about some events, and then get you talking with questions and answers. And not because we're at a tennis ranch, but because it actually happened. I'm going to start with this story from 10 years ago at the Bellingham, Washington Tennis Club when I was living in Blaine, Washington. And I'd finished playing a tennis match, and I was in the locker room. I'd gone into the sauna. There was one other man there, and he asked the inevitable question that you always get asked when you meet someone: what do you do? And you and I both know as a minister, you sit there and go, okay, what am I going to say about this? How much do I want to get into this with another naked man in the sauna? And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, well, I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister. And he looked at me, and he stopped, and he went, that's interesting. I grew up a Unitarian Universalist in the state of Massachusetts. And I went, where did you grow up? He said, well, I went to the church in Winchester. And I remember it very clearly. It was a really interesting church. We even had a gay minister. And I said, what year was this? And he said it was in the 1960s. And we all knew we couldn't talk about it. But everyone in the congregation knew that our minister, who was Bob Storer, was gay, but that if he was going to keep his job, we had to keep quiet too. And this story was confirmed a little bit later when I was talking with Ralph Miro, who said, oh yes, every minister who generally was known to be gay or lesbian in the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s were fired by their congregation for being gay. He said, I even know of one congregation that fired its minister but in an act of compassion so that the man would have a job, rehired that man as their janitor. This is what compassion was like at that particular time. And one of the things that I want to impress on all of us is that each of these stories, each of these moments happened within a particular time, not only within Unitarian Universalism, but what was going on at the world as well. And in fact, for a congregation to even think of rehiring someone who they knew was gay at that particular time probably was as much of an act of compassion as could have been had in the 1940s or 1950s. And so we're not happening, we look at all what's happening in the world and it's like, what else is going on? What's affecting that? And so much of what happened in terms of our history around our ministers, around the different events in Unitarian Universalisms, definitely happened in multiple contexts. They happened within the context of our faith and what was going on in the wider world. One of the other people who was trying to be a pioneer was a minister named Charles Vickery. Some of you may know him from the Service Committee. He eventually went to Mexico to Mexico City, to try and start a Unitarian Universalist there, and to work with the Americans and the Mexicans on trying to create a safe space for gay and lesbian people. And in 1970, that was too soon. He couldn't do it. It wasn't allowed by the larger society and for the church to happen. Now, how do I know this story? Well, Carl Seberg wrote about it. And it is interesting, who are the people who remember these stories? Who are the people who tell these stories so that future generations remember them? One of the things that delighted me about this conference, other than probably being one of the youngest people in the room, is that there is a lot of known history here that is going to disappear and go away as time goes on. And who is going to remember the stories? Not only the big stories, but the little stories of what people had to do. When I was in seminary at Starr King in the mid-1990s, Alicia Forsey arranged for me to have lunch with a UU minister, a man named James Stahl. Some of you who remembers at least the name James Stahl. He was the first minister to come out in Unitarian Universalism in 1969 at a youth conference in Colorado. He'd been serving our congregation in the Tri-Cities area of Washington, Kennewick, Richland, and Pasco. This was 2 months after the Stonewall riots that he came out, and 2 years after the UUA had said, we don't need to be promoting these issues. There had been a survey done of Unitarian Universalists in 1967 that had said, we don't need to be promoting it, this people can just not talk about this and be quiet. And it was pretty overwhelming. So he came out to this conference. He was fired that year and never served another congregation again. He was, however, working as a chaplain in the city of San Francisco at a hospital, which he had been doing. Now, he told me all of this story and so many more. And of course, what I remember, because it was a different time and era, was the fact that he smoked and blew smoke in my face the entire time we were talking. Still, it was fascinating to be present to this kind of history. Because he talked about it was the youth who had encouraged him to do that. And how often in our movement has it been the youth of our movement who have brought about the change, who have encouraged people to take risks that wouldn't have happened at all. What was interesting as I was preparing to work on this, what I went and did is I pulled old UUA directories and just went down the list. Whose name did I know? Whose name did I recognize? Who had told me a story about? And I started in 1961. Now, one of the fascinating things I did for 1961 was not only look at the people who were at least closeted at that particular time, but I also took account of the number of women who were serving in UU ministry at that time, who were mostly Universalists, and who were few and far between. I noticed 12 women serving our faith in 1961. And one of the things I was really noticing was how, as the number of women increased in our movement throughout, how much easier all of this became, and the connections between the two. And the number of ministers I saw who clearly were closeted, who would later come out at that particular time, names like Ken McLean, Frank Robinson, Carl Whittier, Jack Lodeman, Gene Navius, Dick Hasey, Jay McElrod, who, if you became a minister about the time I did, lived in Victoria, British Columbia, and was probably on the UUMA chat more than any other minister that we had. Dean Starr. It was in the 70s that some people began to not only become ministers, but it would eventually came out. 2 weeks ago, I was in Racine, Wisconsin, where Tony Larson was called in 1975, and just left after 43 years in the ministry. That was a very interesting visit on so many levels. And one of the things that fascinated me is that when he did come out in his congregation, the number of people who left. And there were people there when I was there 2 weeks ago, or a month ago, who clearly remember the stories of the people who left. And them trying to figure out, what are we going to do now that we are at this particular moment? He also, at least one Christmas Eve service, they had a ritual where people came up and wrote something down which Tony read. And at least 1 year during his ministry, he had to read something so homophobic that it made the entire congregation gasp, and yet he felt like he had to read it. And the other thing that story makes me think about are the contexts in which people served their ministry. What did people have to do in order to be a UU minister and be gay at a particular time? One of the things that I was constantly aware of was how often or how little people actually got to tell their story in the 70s and 80s as an openly gay or lesbian and eventually bi and trans minister. There would be people in our congregations who would count how many times someone even used the words gay or lesbian. I'll talk more about that later on. One of my favorite Tony Larson story, though, is as he became out, as it became more public, as his congregation became deeper and deeper allies, Tony was very fond at pulling jokes on people in congregations, in his congregation, and doing this in kind of safe but embarrassing ways. Often these events would happen at GA. Diana Paval, who is a longtime member of the congregation, would say Tony was notorious for being in a crowded elevator at GA, looking at one of his congregants, getting this big grin on his face where the congregant knew they were in trouble, and saying, "Well, how long have you known your mother is a lesbian?" To which the congregant had no response whatsoever. And then Tony would get off the elevator. The things you had to do to survive. Even at the UUA, one of the interesting pieces of history is the connections, not only around gender and sexual orientation, but about race and sexual orientation. You see this in the creation of what would first become the Office of Gay Affairs, which lasted for less than a year, and then became the Office of Gay Concerns. It was modeled after the Office of Black Affairs at the time. There was trying to be consistency, and then it changed. But one of the reasons we had an Office of Gay Affairs, Concerns, lesbian and gay concerns, and on and on and on, happened because of the walkout of the African Americans in 1969, when that happened at the General Assembly in Cleveland. The UUA, when the resolution came forward from Dick Nash, UU minister in California, one of the original pioneers within the movement, trying to do this work, started what would eventually evolve into Interweave. Was when he began pushing for this and the idea of the office. The UUA, one, didn't have the money, but people voted for the office because they were afraid of another walkout. And that was probably one of the reasons why this started, why we had this particular movement. Now, we voted for an office in 1973. We didn't have an office until 1974 with funding, and we didn't have a director until 1976. For the first at least 15 years or so, I'm looking at Meg and Jay because they actually lived this, the office was only half-time. People would find other work. Bob Wheatley was the director of the Office of Aging. When he was the director, Jay was tried to be employed by what was now called Interweave for a while, UULGC, and we eventually were able to move it to full-time. But the first director was not even a UU minister. It was a woman from the National Organization of Women, a woman named Arlie Scott. And Nancy Heslett, who was my predecessor as the administrator for the Transitions Office, would tell the story that she would get on the elevator at the UUA in 1976 and people would walk off because they didn't want to be in the same elevator as a lesbian. This is a part of our history. She wasn't invited out to a congregation for a year and a half. The first minister to invite her out to speak actually to a congregation was Ken McLean. And it is interesting to see how all of this evolved. There was a vote in 1974 to try and take the office away at General Assembly, and it survived a close vote. So we had a lot of trepidation, and we do have a lot of liking to pat ourselves on the back, but this was a real struggle. And struggle for people. They were slowly, again, like Tony, the people who began to come in who weren't out but would begin at some point in their careers to come out as their congregation. Bob Shively, Jody Shipley, Joy Atkinson, and one of my interim ministers, Tom Payne, African-American man who came out as bisexual at a certain point. But most of their careers, they weren't out as they were serving. There was this group, at least two of whom were here in around the turn of the 1970s, 1980s, in between that time, 78 to 82. Barb and Ann, you're here. Doug Strong, Mark Bellatini, all a part of a group of students at Star King who were wrestling with how are we going to do ministry and be gay or lesbian. It was Diane Miller who did the first move and hired an out young minister named Bart Bellatini in San Francisco to come and work with them for a year. Doug would then go to Maine and work with Eastport, and then Ann and Barb would start their careers after that. But it was a time of real moment and a time of real figuring that out. Also at this time was the person who would become my introduction to Unitarian Universalist minister, Charlie Cast, who went to Lexington, Kentucky. Some of the search committee knew, some of them didn't figure it out. It was still a time where if you couldn't figure it out, that was actually preferable by some people. But he came to Lexington, and I happened to meet him one night. It was a month after I had come out. And one of the little bars in Lexington, of which there were 4, I was sitting. I'd gotten to know a couple of people in the bar. And Tommy, this guy, said, you know, you talk like a friend of mine. And I want you to meet him. His name is Charlie. So he brings Charlie Cast over to me. We talk for a minute. And I think, oh, wow, not only is there a gay minister, but he's out on a bar on a Saturday night before he has to preach. This is so different from the Southern Baptist Church I grew up in. I may have to go and see what this church is about. So I told him I was going to come and visit the church. I showed up the next day. And the church was celebrating its 35th anniversary. And we ended the service after Charlie talked about the history of the church and the history of liberal religion in Lexington, Kentucky. And we went outside and we gave the church building a hug. Now, we'd never done anything like that in the Southern Baptist Church. I'd grown in before. But I was so impressed that a faith could actually be different than that I ended up staying and became a member within a month. And a lot of that is because of Charlie's presence in the community. And these were so many of the pioneers, the people who could really not talk about themselves, but were still expected to be the ministers of congregations. And could and could not tell the stories of their lives. And that summer that I joined, this was 1985, one of our members went off to General Assembly and came back after having attended a UULGC meeting that literally sort of changed the history even more of the Lexington Church, because one of our members had gone and heard a presentation by Lucy Hitchcock, who at the time was serving as the ministers of our congregations in Fargo and Bismarck, North Dakota. And she told the story of the work of her work in North Dakota was, and there's a mention of this back there on the back table, was the work was for the gay, lesbian, bi, and soon-to-be trans people, was to become ordinary in our congregation, and realizing how profound that would be for our congregation. And that sort of became the work of the Lexington, Kentucky Church, with what at the time was pretty remarkable, because there were actually within 5 years, there were actually 5 out people in the Lexington, Kentucky Church. And you have to understand, at that time, most of our congregation had the capacity for 1 out gay or lesbian or bi trans person in the 1980s, and more made them nervous. But so often it was the ministers who were slowly going out into search in the process. Another pioneer really worth talking about, who many of you remember very fondly, Dorothy used his words last night, was Mark DeWolf, who had a huge impact in our moment. I remember going to my first General Assembly in 1987, Little Rock, Arkansas. The hotel room was $39 a night, and there were like 1,400 people who were a part of that particular General Assembly. And Mark was one of those popular speakers there because of the work that he was doing in the Toronto area at its church in Mississauga. It would be the next year later that he would come back and announce to people who knew that he was also living with HIV, and then would pass away. But his impact on the denomination was significant for what he did. The 1987 GA was also critical, and I'll talk more about this in the next section, because that was where we passed the resolution where we had to do some kind of protest anytime we visited a state that had sodomy laws. And that's its own story, which we'll get into more. But we passed that in large part from having decided to not go to Phoenix the next year, because they weren't honoring, the state didn't honor Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday. So the connections, again, are significant. And we also had ministers during this time who would never once talk about their identity. I talked with a congregant recently who was a longtime member of one of our congregations. I won't say who to protect the minister's name, but they said she never once talked about being a lesbian the entire time we served, and we all knew it. But she didn't feel like she could. And how many of our ministers did just exactly that? In order to do that, I was doing a Beyond Categorical Thinking in the late 90s at First Church in Houston, Texas. The late Mary Harrington, my good friend, and classmate at Star King, was the interim assistant minister at the time. She said, Bob has never once talked to the congregation in my entire year here about being gay. And the number of people who made that kind of sacrifice to only share part of their lives or not share their lives at all in order to make it. In the mid-'80s, we also had different kind of folks who really sort of shook things up. This was the time of the AIDS epidemic. It was a large part of some of the work that Jay paid attention to. Joe Chauncey, who was a chaplain in Atlanta, primarily doing AIDS chaplaincy work. Several of us who were at Star King in the late 80s and early 90s did our CPE at San Francisco General Hospital on the AIDS ward. And it was also a time when we stood up and took notice. But so much of the work that Jay did, and I'm going to let you tell more of this story later in here, and you should talk to him about it, was around getting the welcoming congregation work going that happened in the mid-'80s with the late 1980s Common Vision Committee trying to put together work. I'll tell a few stories about that. Leslie Phillips was the chair of the Common Vision's task force, and we made it through. And it wasn't always easy to make it through at that particular time. I remember that several of us went, Jay is laughing, he remembers. Several of us went to Boston to sort of talk about what this program could be. And we met at Arlington Street Church. And somehow, again, we made it through the workshop and put together a report that would become the welcoming congregation. We spent more time arguing about whether or not we should be welcoming congregation or welcoming church than anything else. There was some conversation about whether should we open and affirming, should we be a welcoming, but the real conversation was about church or congregation. It left three of us the next morning, Helen Bishop, Joan Mason, and myself, who came up with what we become the 15 guidelines and action steps for a welcoming congregation. And Jay preached the sermon. That's literally what I remember from that weekend, other than I stayed in 3 different houses on 3 different nights because we were all doing home hospitality. But we began to see more changes, and more women came into the movement, and more lesbian women came into the movement and were out. And that had a real significant impact. Dorothy, Gretchen, Terry Kime, Liz Benjamin, Nancy Arnold, so many people who would come and go and serve. Annie Holmes, Barbara Dunbar Burke, so many people who would get out and sort of reduce the stereotype and make it more of a multiple story as opposed to a single story. Because so often people were reduced to that single story, whatever it was. It was during this time, and again, you should talk to Barbara and Ann. I remember talking with Ann one summer at Lake Geneva about what had happened in Community Church when they had tried to become called as the associate ministers at Community at New York City. And the vote failed because people who had not been regular attenders but were still members of the church came in and voted against their call. The interesting thing about that, I don't know if this will just make you sigh or give you a new perspective. Community Church just had a vote on whether to do a developmental ministry or to go into search. A group of people who weren't regular attenders came in and basically switched the vote so that they would go into a regular settled search, as opposed to the congregation had been leaning toward doing developmental ministry. It's interesting what stays in our systems and where the power is. But this also happened to Terry Kime in Massachusetts. I believe it was Plymouth. I look at Diane because Terry Kime, she'd been serving in Erie, Pennsylvania. I believe Doris Hunter told me the story, had been the candidate, I believe, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and had also not gotten a call vote because she hadn't gotten the right percentage in there. And it was just a reminder, because we were always patting ourselves on the back because we were half a step ahead of society, so therefore we were better. And it was easy for us to forget that we had real work to do. And we're still doing it. It was in the early 90s that Amanda Aikman won literally every sermon contest one could win. Jory Agate started at the youth office. Meg Riley came in after Scott Alexander. And Meg, again, can tell more of her story than I can, but it was Meg's work in the office that really sort of shifted our work beyond what was going on within our congregation to us look at what was going on outside in the wider world, particularly in regards to what the far right was doing, and helped create a shift that would launch what we would do around social justice and being willing to be a voice, which took a long period of time for us to really be able to do. It was during this time, I look at Dee, where are you? There you are. Dee was at Star King teaching a class on gay, lesbian, and bisexual spiritualities that was well attended, in which people from other seminaries had to take for not credit because they couldn't have it on their transcripts. Amanda, we'll have time for questions.
No, I just want to show you what the priests who
Yeah, but it's being recorded, so.
I just want to show you what you could tell who was coming to Dee's class. These priests from the Catholic seminaries, they would come down the sidewalk looking just like this.
It was very scary for so many people from other denominations. And when I taught the class a couple of years later, Dee's first statement to me was, ask Rebecca to come. Has she come out to you yet? And it was like, really? Oh, wow. But there are all these stories that weren't told and weren't known. It was when Dee, speaking of work that we still had to do, was doing her internship at Westside in Knoxville, that she had to take her children to Tennessee Valley because they were treated better there than they were at her home congregation in Westside. Still so much work that we had to do. We had Leslie Phillips as our first out trans minister, though those of us who knew her remember her more as a Philadelphia lawyer turned minister than we did trans. And then there was a woman at Star King named Erin Melby, who had been a chaplain, who wanted to be a chaplain, when I was working in the Star King office, for those of you who knew Bob Kimball, she wanted him desperately to speak at her ordination, and it was the most, what's the word I want? I've never seen him so avoidant of anything in particular other than not wanting to speak at her ordination service. It was after this time that we started having more and more African American and people of color ministers starting to come out. Carlton, Elliott Smith, Alma Crawford, people who would lead the way, Cheryl Walker, other folks who would join our movement. I remember it was about 10 years later when I was at Lake Geneva, and it was Hal Lind who had suggested to both Barb and Ann, you all need to think about doing co-ministry again. And it was in the summer, and we were still all waiting to hear the vote on pins and needles. Had this happened in Evanston? Had you all been called? And I remember being at camp, and there was a cheer that went up when we learned that it had actually happened. Because I can't remember if you had been theme speakers before or after that, but I think it was after. But you were well known by everyone at camp, and much loved. Also in 1989, those of you who are at General Assembly may remember a somewhat contentious conversation at General Assembly at Yale about the welcoming congregation. we're talking about supporting gay, lesbian, and bisexual rites of passage, and people were like, "What's a bisexual rites of passage? What does that mean for our congregations?" And it was quite a time. It was also then, there had been various previous efforts that we really solidified and launched from the association, the Beyond Categorical Thinking program, which was directed at congregations. This is where we passed the resolution and saying we were not going to allow discrimination as part of the search process. And this program was created and officially launched at that General Assembly. Those of you who remember Jackie James, who was also working on the hymn book at the time, a staff person for the hymn book, was the person who oversaw this program. It was at this time that a really wonderful man, many of you will remember, Dick Hasty, came out. Had served for a long time at our congregation in Portland, Maine, had gotten divorced, had come out, and he was one of the lead trainers in Beyond Categorical Thinking in the early years. And often he would go to a congregation and people would say, "Well, you could be our minister." And it got to the point where he had to figure out, where could I not do a BCT, as he was trying to find a place to serve, because once you had done the training, all of a sudden you were ineligible to serve. He was eventually called to Springfield, Illinois, where he finished out his Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, where he made a difference. But this program was intentional about, and is intentional about, work around helping our congregations look at the biases they have towards ministers of color, ministers who now identify as bisexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender. Transgender didn't happen until the late 90s. And ministers with disabilities. And now it's expanded even beyond that to talk about mental health issues, which we really didn't talk about. In the first year that we had Beyond Categorical Thinking, 7 of our congregations in Search, there were like 45 that year, elected to do BCT because they thought they might need it. Today, just to give you some sort of balance, it's almost at 100%. I'll talk more about that later. It was in the late 90s that we had Pam Langston Daly serving our congregation in Aptos, who transitioned, was in the process of transitioning from Pam to Paul. Pam was not able to survive the transition and still be the minister of the time. It was just simply too much for the congregation to be able to weather. But that in some ways is not atypical. I mean, if you got divorced at that particular time, you were pretty much counseled you're not going to be able to survive at this particular time. Our congregations could only handle so much change, and we have seen that change. Sean Dennison and Laurie Affont, 2 ministers who also came into our movement, identifying as transgender. Sean we still know, Laurie we have basically lost to all of that. And so much of what happens to the people who go first is very different from the next generation. I'm sure if you were to talk with so many of our women, our people of color, our gay, lesbian, bi, people with physical disabilities, the people who were the first people to go through had a much harder time, and had a much harder time escaping being seen as anything other than one identity. But these are the people who helped create the way, so that, I mean, my favorite story so far from this year's search is we have a congregation looking at a minister who uses gender-neutral pronouns, which even 5 years ago they wouldn't have looked at this person. And the chair of the search committee said, "At our last meeting, we spent 10 minutes practicing they, them, theirs." I mean, this is how quickly in the last time, but it was all set up by people who were there so many years ago. And then we had different kind of pioneers, people who all of a sudden were treated a little differently. Rob Hardy's, after a year in Northern California being called to All Souls, D.C. Gene Pupke, after serving a couple of small congregations in Washington, going and working with Richmond. The next group of, in particular, people of color, women of color who came in, Marta Valentin, Sophia Betancourt, not only the first woman president, but the first queer president we've had of our association. Alicia Ford, Cheryl Walker, Jacqueline Duhart. Jacqueline Duhart is the first ever contract minister named Minister Emeritus of a congregation in Oakland. In the early 2000s, we saw our first folks who identify as polyamorous beginning to enter the ministry and doing that particular work. We also saw Cynthia Kane, who was one of our chaplains, struggling with how out she could be until the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It had actually gotten to the point where she had actually married Drew Johnston for a period of time, basically to give her cover and to help in too. And we really got to see some things change as different events happened in history. I'll talk more about this in the next half, but when the Supreme Court struck down sodomy laws was a big moment. When we ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell. When civil unions came to Vermont. When marriage equality came to first Massachusetts. And then to other places. Things that really shifted the barrier. And I think so much of the work that happened in Unitarian Universalism that then, I'll tell a story in the second half about Vermont, was led by Unitarian Universalist ministers who were willing to be brave, willing to be out, willing to do things that hadn't really been done before in so many places. So I'm going to stop for questions about this in a minute, but I'd like to do an exercise just to really sort of contextualize and to get us thinking about where we fit into the movement and how that fit in. So what I would like for you to do, starting in this corner with 1950 and over to this corner, maybe up here to present day, line up in chronological order as best you can about when you became a Unitarian Universalist. So if it was 1950 or earlier, start here. The people who are newer, start here.
Many early ones. Homereds, all the homereds.
Keep moving that way.
Joel, what year are you?
Move down.
Joel Weaver, what year are you?
Chaos.
All right, let me try someone else. Dorothy. Dorothy, what year are you? 81. Dee, what year are you? 79. 76. All right, this side of the room right here, I want 1950s and 1960s. 1970s and 1980s down to that corner. 1990s, 2000s, 2010s.
Got it. Follow instructions.
You were born into it. What year? Jim, what year? So, Unitarian or Universalist? All right. It's interesting for this to happen, and this is actually what I was hoping was going to happen. And what year? What? 93. Jane, what year? 94. Ade, what year?
2004.
Now think about when you either knew, because the people at this end all were born, but I mean, all of these people were born Unitarian. I didn't see anyone born a Universalist? One. And then where is 1970? 70, 71. Because 70 and 71 is the first time we made a public statement in support of gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. I mean, for those of you who were before, I'm sure you remember this just wasn't talked about in any kind of...
We were kids. We weren't paying attention. But Keith, I went to AYS in 1973.
But that was 73. I mean, the Stonewall riots, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary, that was the moment when we went from don't ask, don't tell in general to all of a sudden, this is something that we're beginning to talk about, we're beginning to explore. How many of you went as a kid through about your sexuality back in the 1970s? How many of you taught about your sexuality? How many of you have taught our whole lives? Interesting, because it was interesting that once again it was our youth who really started things off for us. How many of you think about the first time you met a UU minister who was openly gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender?
How many of us think about it?
How many of you remember the first time you learned of a minister who was gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender? Because often that is such a key moment in so many people's understandings of when things began to shift in terms of what our faith could be. We'll do an exercise in the next moment that asks you some more questions about when you learned just about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender folks in general. How many of you went to a General Assembly in the 1960s? How about in the 1970s? 1980s? 1990s? 2000s? Anyone there at the 1970 General Assembly where we did the first resolution in support? Carol? Diane? The UUA and the UCC both voted that year to support non-discrimination toward, I believe the actual word in the resolution is homosexuals and bisexuals. And
The copy of the resolution is on the wall.
Yeah. And then in 1984, we had a resolution in 77 basically against Anita Bryant. But in 1984 was when we voted to support civil unions. Who was there at that General Assembly in Columbus, Ohio? 84. 84. Some of you may remember that this came about because there were a lot of ministers who were wanting to do ceremonies of union and were having fights with their congregations about could they do them, where could they do them, could they happen on church property, and the resolution came at the request to support ministers doing that. Who was there in 87 in Little Rock? That's where we voted on the sodomy law protest, which I'll talk about in the next one. 89 when we voted on welcoming congregation and non-discrimination for ministers. 96 when I know that Dee was on stage, but all the people in support of equal marriage and all of our ministers who were in same-sex relationships were brought up on stage. How many of you were up on stage?
In the choir.
You were in the choir. You've always been in multiple choirs, Gretchen. I mean, and so this work. How many of you were ministers serving a congregation that went through the welcoming congregation process? Sometimes it would have been. Sometimes 91 Brewster was certified as the worst welcoming congregation.
The worst?
First. No. The first welcoming congregation, when I came into the office, there were 57 welcoming congregations that had been certified. Today, it's something like 87% of Unitarian Universalists go to a welcoming congregation. And I think we only have 2 or 3 congregations over 100 people that aren't now.
We had to, it was after we were called to Evanston that they did the work. They signed on to be one, but hadn't done the work. And Linda LaPlante, may her name be praised, got people to actually do the work and get certified.
Yeah, it's really...
Sometimes you just got to know one to do the work.
Right. Well, and so often congregations would do the process because of 1 or 2 people in the congregation. I mean, I remember working with a congregation in Duxbury where it was a PFLAC mom who was insistent she was going to pass this on for her late son. She was going to make sure the congregation did that. And fortunately, she was a matriarch in the church, so she could make it happen, but it was... because that's also a dynamic too. Okay, you all can go back to your seats now. We're going to take a break in a couple of minutes, but I want to give people, and we'll have more time in the next section, so don't worry about it. But about anything I said or any memory that came up that you want to take, we'll take about 5 minutes for questions. We have a microphone that, since this is being recorded, I'd encourage everyone to speak into. Dwayne?
Just a brief story. Keith mentioned Aaron Milby, who was a member and affiliated minister with the church in Palo Alto, where I did my internship and then served as sabbatical filling the next year. She was in the VA hospital. I went to visit her and brought flowers, and she told me later that some of the other patients were remarking on her boyfriend who had brought those wonderful flowers to her. It was just so complex, there was no way to process all of that.
Judy.
Keith, you mentioned, but I really want to lift up and emphasize AYS, because I think, and you're going to be hearing, I'm going to be talking about Gene Navius tomorrow, who was one of the people who started AYS, but he said that AYS really provided a turning point for the UUA's attitude toward GLBT people, because AYS was so liberal and the youth were pushing this.
I also think that one of the people to really talk about, and since you're talking about him, Gene Navius really was working behind the scenes, going to the UUA in the late 1960s and doing the work that he did. Before he died, he became a beyond categorical thinking trainer. And in typical Gene style, I literally spent an hour and a half with him one day on the phone so he'd get every piece of the workshop just right. It was maybe the most exhausting one-on-one training I've ever done. But he was going to do this in a particular way. And I think it was that exactness that really helped in the creation of About Your Sexuality and how it was moving out. It was always like, we have to do it in a particular way, otherwise it might fail. That was so much of the attitude that was going on at a particular time. I also think that just simply having, I mean, it used to be, and how many of you remember, I didn't think to talk about this in my notes, but you remember when Concord made national news, Bryant Gumbel, for showing, I mean, it used to be that you had to have a parent session, have them work through things, show them everything that was going to be in the curriculum, get both parental approvals. Concord only did it for one parent, and Bryant Gumbel and Bobby Nelson was on the show talking about it. But I think because the way the program was set up and the way that the parent sessions was set up, it almost invariably led them to talking about gay, lesbian, bi, sexual orientation issues as a way to really be introduced to the program. One of the stories that I didn't tell was that there was a woman in the Lexington, Kentucky church who was determined to diversify the church. This was back in the 1980s. A woman named Barbara Vance, who died a few years later of cancer. She was the one who brought back the story of Lucy Hitchcock. But she said two things. One, I'm resigning my position on the board so that you can be the first openly gay person in the church to serve on the church board, because we need to diversify it that way. And two, I'm going to make you teach AYS this year. I was a 25-year-old student, or teacher at the time, but I was actually really quite delighted to do both of that. But and the first session we did with the parents, it was like, this is what we ended up talking about. This is what really sparked the conversation. Meg, you wanted to say something.
You lifted up Jim Stoll coming out at an LRY conference, but I just really wanted to lift up LRY a little bit more. At that conference, on the exec of LRY at the time were Wayne Arneson, Rob Eller Isaacs. Homophobia became so central to the whole youth group because they loved Jim Stoll. And so often it is the love of one person that changes things. But, you know, when youth love you, they really love you. And I just think, I don't know if anybody was in LRY at that time, but I think that LRY really deserves a huge thank you for the denomination moving.
I think that's very true. Other questions? Barbara?
Can I just make a little story?
Yeah.
Talking about AYS, when I took AYS when I was 13 or 14, and I so remember the section on same-sex relations, which was a big part of the AYS curriculum. And the reason I remember it is because we were looking at the slideshow, and up popped a picture of my father. And of course it was terrible, but it's not as bad as it sounds, because it turns out that in Massachusetts, when they were creating AYS, they used Unitarians as the non-sexual pictures, and what they showed was a picture of two men, one of them happened to be my father, with their faces pressed together very close, and it was a close-up like this, and you were supposed to respond. How did that make you feel to see these two men so close together? And then it pulls out, and you see they're at a bar, and you know it's one of those sort of jolly guys at the bar picture, but it's of course stayed with me for lots of reasons.
But how did it make you feel,
How
Barbara?
did it make me feel? It was memorable, I'll tell you.
One more question, and then we'll take a break. Craig.
I'm curious about the evolution of our seminaries of Meadville and Starr King when they accepting students who are openly gay, and the story behind that. I'm just curious.
Well, others may have more of a story here. I just remember in talking about this with Ron Cook at Starr King when I was there, he did say Jim Stoll never talked about this when he was there, and it could talk about it, even though he said as a student it wouldn't have surprised him, and he thought at least Bob Kimball would have been supportive at that particular time. Star King was such a radical place for so long. I mean, I arrived at Star King, and there were stories of nude chapels and and for a while anything goes. And one of the things that would be really sort of interesting to talk about in general are the effects of the late 60s and 70s on Unitarian Universalism. I mean, because that, in not always positive ways, there were some positive things, but some of the stories of indiscretion, misconduct, hot tubs, and sort of a reaction to what was going on in the world, and gee, it can be different, still profoundly affects our congregations 40 years later. Pardon? And it wasn't only UU seminaries. No. But the one story, this has nothing to do with your question, Craig, but Roger Jones, who many of you know, good friend of mine, we had decided in the early 1990s at the Dallas UULGC convocation that we were probably headed towards seminary at some point. And it was at the 1993 convocation that he told me, because you didn't have email then, you didn't have anything, you just picked up the phone and wrote letters, told me, guess what, I'm going to seminary, I'm going to Meadville Lombard. And I went, guess what, I'm going to seminary, I'm going to Star King. And it was, and both of our experiences there, because we would see each other, we'd room together at GA. I mean, by the time we got to the early 90s, it just was not paid attention to in the ways that it had been in the 70s and 80s. It had been no big deal. And for those of you who went to seminary in the 70s and 80s, your stories are different. I really think the story of Barb and Doug and Mark, is really one of the pioneering seminary stories that we have in our movement. Lindy was a little later. And Heller. But this is really your all story to tell, so because you remember most of it, and all I got was secondhand information from various folks, mainly from Mark, actually, as he would talk about what it was like to be then. And Ron said that when Mark was in seminary, he was just terrified that how is he going to be a whole person, and yet how could he be a minister at the same time? Would this just going to dominate his ministry to the point where he couldn't do anything else but talk about this?
Which Mark are we talking?
Moshe DeWolf. Mark Moshe DeWolf. No, it was Mark Moshe DeWolf. And it was one of his struggles. I mean, but even in the 90s, I can remember Ron Cook talking, Dottie Stone, Dottie, where are you? Talking in preaching class, and I remember Ron saying to me at one point, be careful how much you talk about this. Because that's what we had to do to survive. Let's take a break. We will come back at 11:10 and talk about some of the key events in Unitarian Universalism and the ministers who were part of that. Oh, it's 11:45. Sorry, I misread the clock because I don't have on my glasses. Let's come back at 11.